Overnight, the Malaysian Prime Minister confirming the disappearance of Flight 370 was a, quote, deliberate act. And just moments ago on this show, a former commercial pilot laid out the dangerous possibility of a Boeing 777 getting into the wrong hands.
A Boeing 777 would make a perfect delivery device for a weapon of mass destruction. This aircraft could very well be somewhere on the ground as we speak, being re-outfitted for some other purpose.
So could this aircraft be on the ground and being prepared for an attack on the West? Joining us now to discuss our terror panel, Ryan Morrow, a national security analyst at Clarion Project, Michael Balboni, a former Homeland Security advisor for New York State, and Amber Barno, a former Army chopper pilot and national security fellow at Independent Women's Forum. Thanks a lot for joining us. Mike, does that possibility, as we just outlined, our last guest outlined, that this aircraft is on the ground and possibly being prepared for something else, is that plausible, and does that concern you?
At this point in time, it's a big aircraft. And
yeah.
It needs a long runway to land.
Right.
You know, and so nobody's identified that type of an airfield that you can actually take and land this.
Right.
The question is, could it have landed in water? Well, you know, we saw it happen in Miracle on the Hudson. That was a miracle. You know, so a lot of things say that that's not possibly plausible. But then again, nothing in this story has been plausible.
That's right.
How do you have a plane, and we were just saying before, in this day and age of the cell phone, we know where everybody is at any moment. You don't know where a plane is right now. So the expectations are all askew on this story.
So, Ryan, the more we learn, the more it seems like there is a very organized plot behind the disappearance of this plane. Who are some of the groups who investigators would be looking at right now?
Well, I think there are definitely two groups that could have been working together or independently. The first is called the East Turkestan Islamic Movement. It is a group that is based out of China and also Pakistan. And then there's an al-Qaeda affiliate called Jamaat Islamiyah that operates in Indonesia and Malaysia. Whoever tried this attack clearly was aiming it at China. They knew that the majority of the passengers were Chinese, which points immediately in the direction of the East Turkestan Islamic Movement.
And there are Islamic separatist movements all throughout China, Western China. I mean, we don't hear much about it, but this is a problem internally for the Chinese, is it not?
Right, and they recently really increased their attacks in China, so this would fit the pattern. And then the reports out there are that authorities are looking at one specific Chinese Muslim from that separatist region of China that was on board that plane and had experience with flight simulation.
Boy, the one thing we kind of taken off the table after 9/11 is cockpit invasion. I mean, I think most people assume it's impossible. The door is hardened. That would never happen again. Do we need to rethink that assumption, do you think, Amber?
Absolutely, we need to rethink that assumption. Nothing should be off the table at this point. A cockpit breach is not impossible. There's been procedures put in place to try to prevent it, especially in the U.S. and under FAA regulations, but not necessarily something that international aviation has to abide by. So there easily could have been a cockpit breach, but also something that we need to remember is whoever is behind this, there was a very sophisticated knowledge of aviation, of aircraft systems, specifically the 777, as well as their comms and electronics. So they really need to be looking into the pilots as well. I'm not saying it's an inside job, but it's something that they need to look into.
Boy, the Malaysian government from day one almost has told us that pilots, there's nothing to see here. These are good guys who love their families. They were good Muslims. And the two Iranian passengers with stolen passports, they're off the table too. How much faith should we put in assessments from the Malaysian government?
Well, here's what we know. Someone turned up to transponder. You can't do that from the cabin. You had to be inside the cockpit. All right, so that's one data point where you start. The challenge here, of course, is this terrorism? Is it crime? You know, we go to someone wanted to commit suicide, right? The Air Egypt incident where the pilot decides to just take the plane down. But like you said, you've got to have that sophisticated knowledge of how to move this plane. If what the New York Times was reporting, that it went up to 45,000 feet and then came back down and maneuvering that way, it does indicate that this person is not just going to crash the plane. Just is looking for a specific purpose.
A specific purpose. Yeah. So that suggests, since we don't actually know what happened to the plane, that is out of the realm of possibility that it is on land, either crashed or landed. I mean, it can land on a much shorter runway than it can take off from. We know that, right?
Well, I think it's far more likely that they intended to crash us into a target or potentially land it somewhere, but probably crash it into a target. Something went wrong, and they had to abort the mission. That's why it crashed into the ocean.
But if they wanted to crash into a target, why did they go to such lengths to disable all the tracking devices on the plane and to camouflage their flight path by zigzagging. Why would they even bother to do that?
And they would have, if their intent was to crash the plane into a target right off the bat, it would have been and a target in the immediate vicinity of takeoff, because you want max fuel, max weight, max airspeed. You don't want to bleed off all of your fuel and things that are going to cause a larger explosion. So it definitely leans more towards they were looking for the use of a 777 for a weapon in the future. So that's where the whole landing comes into play.
A remarkable story. Thank you for enlightening us on it.
Travis.
All three of you. Appreciate it. Well, the search for missing Flight 370 continues. Government officials reveal the disappearance was, in fact, deliberate, a hijacking of some kind. Gentlemen, Amber, thanks for joining us this morning.
Thank you.
So, Steve, why were we sure 5 days ago this was not terrorism?
Well, there was no evidence that pointed towards anything but terrorism. There was no forensic evidence in the sea, no debris, nothing of a sort. In addition to that, you had two suspects, and those were the individuals that had the passports that were false passports. So that makes it very clear that something went wrong. Believe, at least based on the evidence that we see now, that this airplane may have been intended to be used on a target somewhere, and there was a struggle in the cockpit if the pilots are not involved, and they're somewhere in the Indian Ocean as we speak.
So does that make sense to you, Amber?
It does, and I think an important element to remember here is that terrorists have been looking for ways to exploit aircraft and aviation for decades. So they're always looking for the next gap or hole in security that they can breach. And unfortunately, with this scenario, it seems that they have found that hole just the way they did on 9/11.
You were suggesting, Ryan, at the very beginning this was terrorism, as the Malaysian government and Interpol were assuring the rest of us, no, it wasn't terrorism. You said right at the beginning, yes, I think this likely was. What would be the point, however, of evading radar just to crash in the ocean?
Well, they were on the way to a target, and for some reason they decided to abort mission. Maybe there was a struggle on the aircraft itself, or there was some sort of problem, but whatever the case may be, they were on the way to a target and decided that it was better to land it, crash it into the ocean. And so at that point we have to ask ourselves, who are the suspects?
Yes.
And the most likely suspects are two groups. The East Turkestan Islamic movement, which is based in China. They're now looking at a Chinese possible suspect, a Chinese Muslim that was on the aircraft, and Jamaat Islamiyah, an Al-Qaeda affiliate based in Indonesia and Malaysia.
So, but why are we certain that the two Iranians traveling on stolen passports aren't behind this?
Well, we're not. What is also a mystery is that no terrorist organization has yet taken full responsibility for this.
Right. And
it may be because it was a failed terrorist attack, meaning that, again, there could have been an intended target. They never got there.
Huh. And an intended target not in China, however, so it was flying backward.
No, right. All passengers, all pilots, no one should be ruled out at this time. What we do know is that whoever was flying the plane, they weren't alone. They were in collaboration with possible pilots or passengers, but they had very sophisticated knowledge of aviation, of the 777 and aviation systems, including the electronics and the communication systems. So no one should be ruled out at this time, but they had, whoever it was did have advanced knowledge and training of the system.
There's usually chatter around events like this, though, that we pick up, isn't there?
Actually, more commonly, not so much, and that's because you wouldn't want to talk on any electronic communications about this plot as it's going. As for the issue of
terrorists are getting more sophisticated about that, then, you think?
Well, they know we're probably tapping their communications. But as for the issue of taking credit, that's a perfectly legitimate theory that they feel that this plot failed, and so they didn't want to take credit. But there was a study done that shows that only a minority of terrorist attacks are actually claimed credit by one of the groups.
You really get a sense watching this, Steve, watching all these other governments bungle the investigation, how impressive U.S. investigators are by comparison.
Look, Tucker, I worked with the National Joint Terrorism Task Force in Washington, D.C. We, the United States of America, are the best of the best. We have the equipment. We have boots on the ground. We have what we call human intelligence. No one does it better than we do, and we will find out eventually what happened.
So does this make you nervous as a U.S. citizen? I mean, they're clearly out there. A lot of us had started to breathe easy after 9/11. Aircraft hasn't been used for terror in a long time.
Well, I think that we should never become complacent. Just because 9/11 happened over a decade ago, it doesn't mean that our adversaries and terrorist organizations aren't working day and night to find that gap in our security in order to bring down terror upon us, which could be quite possibly be the scenario with this crash.
If someone from the cabin got into the cockpit, that's really troubling, because the rest of us have been assured those cockpit doors are hardened and that can't happen again.
Well, interestingly enough, there was recent testimony in a trial by an al-Qaeda terrorist that said that towards the end of 2001, he knew Richard Reed, the shoe bomber,
yes,
and that he knew of a plot where they had several Malaysians, including a pilot, where they would hijack a plane by using, I guess, some smaller shoe bomb in order to blast open the cockpit door. So we know that the scenario we're talking about right now was discussed by al-Qaeda operatives in the past.
In breaching a cockpit door, if you really want to get in, and you have this elaborate, sophisticated plan, pilots get up and stretch their legs, they get out to go get a cup of coffee, whatever the reason, the door often opens, especially in these international flights where they don't have the same restrictions with opening the cockpit door as we do in the U.S.
But it's still pretty weird that whoever did this would go to these extraordinary lengths, really, to avoid radar and turn off the transponder.
Because, Tucker, I believe that they had a target. There was an intended target, and they failed. And look, you look at how erratic the altitude of that aircraft was. That, to me, seems like there was a struggle in that cockpit. I mean, we could be wrong, but it seems like evidence points towards there was a struggle in the cockpit when that plane, as you say, was turned around for a target. The next step is to try to find out what that target possibly was.
Thanks to all three of you. I think you'll be joining us later on the show, which we appreciate.
Thanks, Tucker.